Hi, it's Kendall. I couldn't join Corey for the first part of the conversation with Steven Osborne, but I listened to the episode the second it was ready, and wow, I was completely pulled in. Steven's story hit me hard, maybe because I've lived through some of this, the shock, the grief, the unraveling of everything you thought you knew. But even knowing what's coming, nothing prepared me for the moment he's on a plane, phone in hand, and everything changes. That discovery, that gut punch, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I just wanted to reach through the speaker and give him a hug. There's humor in there too, because sometimes the only way to survive the absurdity of a DNA surprise is to laugh through the tears. But make no mistake, Steven's story is layered and there are still some wild revelations waiting in part 2. Let's get into it.
Hey, Steve. Welcome to the Family Twist podcast.
Thank you, Corey. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's funny because the first question I want to ask you, it's a little bit ironic because Kendall's not here for this episode. He got called into some work stuff, but I'm just curious what it was like for you to work on a super personal creative project like your book with your spouse. And I know for Kendall and I, like doing this podcast together for the last 3+ years has strengthened our relationship, but I imagine that wouldn't be the case for every couple. So you could start talking about that a little bit.
Well, I imagine it's not the case for every couple. It was the case for Becky and I. But I have to tell you, I started with some trepidation. We didn't even start off writing a book. She was just trying to help me through my journey, help me with my healing. And I was really struggling, as many men do, but don't want to talk about it or don't know how to handle it. Or we have these things called feelings and we're not really sure what those are. And she came to me one day and said, I have read multiple times that writing, like journaling, is a great healing tool, a great avenue for healing. Why don't you try that? I was like, okay, whatever. So I wrote some stuff and she said, let me read it. I did. And she said, that's great. You should write some more. So I kept writing. And I've never written anything other than an email or a letter before, not necessarily an author. She just kept reading it and said, some of this stuff is pretty good. I think it might be helpful for other people to read it. What would you think about maybe turning it into a book? And I said, well, I guess we could, and memoir. So, of course, we Google how many words is a typical memoir, and it was 60,000 to 80,000. And she said, how many do you have? I said, 11,000, and I've pretty much written the entire story. She said, well, have you written about this? I was like, well, no, I haven't written about that. So she goes, just write. And she kept saying, just write. And then she would read it and she'd say, okay, well, you mentioned this, but what is that? I said, well, you know what that is. She goes, yeah, but the reader won't. So the story just continued to expand. We ended up with 80,000 words. And at first, probably our first month, I have very different writing styles. She has very different things that she expects in a book. And there's a couple times when it was a little contentious. But I'd like to say I'm very coachable, and she's a great reader. She reads all the time. I don't read that much. And so she said, she really helped coach me. And I can even tell from my original writings to what eventually went in the book, a vast improvement. And that, of course, is because, as we all know, our spouses tend to make us better.
For sure. Would you be open to us borrowing Becky? Because Kendall doesn't always take my advice. But if we had Becky in our corner, because we're trying to put together, a book for Kendall now, that would be great to have her just, poke and prod.
You said that as a joke, but genuinely, yes, because she is a voracious reader. And she was basically my alpha editor. And she'd love to. Corey. And I tell you what, she would actually be a good service.
Awesome. I can't edit my own stuff.
Nobody can.
And Kendall will tell you my grammar is not the best. So I need a heavy hand with an editor. And I think the same for Kendall. Kendall's a great copy editor. He definitely has cleaned up a lot of my stuff. But I think just to have an outside, somebody else looking in who's not as intimate with our story or his story, would be great.
Right.
So
Because they get you to write the things that you need to write, right?
Yeah.
We all make assumptions that everybody knows everything that we know. They don't. I know I made several assumptions about, I thought people understood the way that I felt as things were happening. And she was like, how did you feel about that? Well, it was pretty obvious how I felt about it. It sucked. It was this, it was that. She was like, you have to write that. You have to put those things in, on the page. So no, she's great. She made the book better. She's continually made me better as a person. And, I know a lot of husbands like to complain about their spouses, but I'd be pretty disingenuous if I did that. If anything, I think she's up for sainthood.
Well, and I think that's important, in these types of situations to have that supportive spouse role, because not everybody does.
You're right.
Like you did and Kendall did. And, talk about adding to the frustration and everything is like to not have the person you're closest to 100% in your corner and understanding everything.
Well, yeah, I didn't experience that. Becky was my rock. She helped me get through this. Matter of fact, she's also the cause of it. So as we like to joke, I blame her for 100% of everything that happened. Because Becky is a part-time forensic genealogist, and the way we actually started down this path was she was doing my family tree. And we'll get into that a little bit here.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's important. I think Kendall and I are both natural caregivers. Not like when somebody is sick, though. We both are horrible at that. But when somebody's going through some emotional trauma, I feel like we're both really good at helping each other out. So shout out to Becky. Thank you, Becky.
I think that's where the physical part comes in, because are quite honestly really big babies when they get sick. They just are. I know I am. I'm horrible. We both had COVID at the same time. She took care of both of us.
Oh, that's awesome.
Anyway.
So a little surprising for you to say that you really hadn't approached creative writing before, aside from emails and business stuff, because you and I know each other a little bit outside of this podcast through the Right to Know organization. And, I heard you speak last year at the Untangling Our Roots Summit and would have just thought like, oh, this is a writer.
Well, and that's only because of my profession. So I've been an entrepreneur for well over 30 years. And the companies that I have run have all been tech companies and sales-based technology companies. I've also been a sales trainer for a really long time. So the stage, speaking, communication has always just been a part of what I do. And so I think the book creation was probably significantly easier just because of that. Sure. I say to people, I've lived my life as a storyteller.
That's awesome. So before we get into the nitty gritty, I do want to say something that I really appreciate about the book and just, your personality in general is embracing, let's say, dark humor, around it, because as, listeners to this podcast know, whenever we're talking to an author who's writing about a DNA discovery, I mean, it's heavy stuff. It's traumatic. It's, it's not all happy endings.
Right.
And so to have that sort of approach, I think that is helpful for people, because humor is definitely healing.
Thank you for bringing that up and for your kind words. It was one of the points that Becky and I bumped heads with the most, which was I had a lot of humor in the book. And she said, this is coming off as a stand-up routine. I don't mind the humor in it, but it has to be appropriate humor. And as we were whittling it down, ironically, the humor that stayed the most was exactly what you just said. It was kind of the dark humor. As you know, you've heard so many of these stories. When this crap starts happening to you, you really only have a couple choices, and sometimes you choose both. You laugh or you cry. And I think you start off with the crying, and eventually you can kind of see the really twisted aspects of it that are somewhat funny.
Right. All right. So let's get into your story, Steve. What was sort of the driving force for you to figure out, like, you had this thought that you have Native American ancestry. So what was the driving force for you to like dig into that and find out,
Sure.
What's my story?
Yeah. Well, I guess it really starts when I was very young. I have a crazy story. I have a crazy, twisted family, even before the DNA surprise. So me and my siblings were children of multiple blended families. I'll try to simplify this a lot. So I had our mom, Barb, and I'm going to use a couple names just because we're going to need to track them. Barb, and my stepdad. They were married. That was one household. And then we had my dad and our stepmom. That was a different household. And me and my sister would spend time in both of those homes. During the week, we would be at Barb's house. During the weekends, we would be at Jack Osborne's house. But all together, between Half, Hole, and Step, I had 14 siblings. 14 siblings. And kind of the bar joke is, I'll name my siblings, and if you can name them when we're done, I buy you a drink. But just to show you how crazy it was, my mom married a man named Ed and had my two older half-sisters, Kathy and Terry. Divorced Ed, married my dad, Jack. Had myself and my younger sister. Laura's important. I'm going to call her my Cameron Diaz sister. And the reason I call her Cameron Diaz sister is because she looks like Cameron Diaz's twin.
Okay.
So, well, she divorced Jack, married my stepdad, Jerry. He had two kids from a previous marriage, Tanya and Renee. And between them, they had a son, Adam. So in the house we were in every week, it was Kathy, Terry, Tanya, Renee, Steve, Laura, Adam. My dad remarried. He remarried a woman who had 8 kids.
Oh.
Arlene, Darlene, Charlene, Francine, Danny, Johnny, Gary, and Jerry, who are not only my stepbrothers and sisters, they're also my second cousins.
Oh.
Yes, but we're all from Kentucky, so it doesn't matter.
Right.
You actually introduce them as your step siblings, second cousins, and no one says anything. But anyway, so here I am. I've got 14 siblings.
Wow.
And in 2 different houses.
Mm.
And I was in my teens before I even figured out what was going on. My mom, Barb, and my dad, Jack, divorced when I was 4. And it was a really contentious situation for the rest of our lives. I had a great stepdad. I had a great stepmom. None of those, evil stepmother stories. I've got 0. They're wonderful people. But my birth mom, Barb, she was a person who had a really serious narcissistic aspect to her personality. And just as I've listened to other podcasts, this is a very common theme with NPEs.
Yep.
That a lot of NPEs have very narcissistic mothers. And that divorce and the way she treated my dad would eventually even drive her and I apart. Because, I loved them both, but I really loved, I love my dad. My dad's my dad. You can't treat him that way.
Right.
As if this is not enough craziness, the home that I spent, 5 days a week in also ended up being a foster home for troubled youth. So we had our 7 kids in our family, and we would take in up to an additional 7 other teens, all with some sort of issue or an emotional baggage or problems, that they had. So, it wasn't enough that we had 7 kids and we had 8 kids in the other house, but we had to bring in another additional 7 kids. So I had nothing that resembled anything even close to a normal childhood. Listening to your podcast and Kendall's story, my mom was very similar to his mom, only she wasn't Southern Baptist. She was Pentecostal.
Okay.
Many people would say there's really no difference between the two. Can I get an amen? Amen. And the other thing is she always told us that we had a significant amount of Native American heritage, which is ironic because that is the one minor detail, which was, by the way, a total lie. The one thing that my mother did that kind of kicked this entire thing off. Corey, I always knew I was different. I always sensed I was different, not just because half of my siblings were my second cousins or because some of my siblings were step siblings or half siblings. I was just different. I didn't look like the other members of my family. I didn't think like them. I didn't act like them. I was experiencing what I'm sure you've heard the term before, monocopsis, which is that something is wrong, but you just can't put your finger on it. And I lived my entire life that way. When I was 11 years old, I asked my mom if I was adopted.
Oh,
Not that that's an evil thing.
sure.
It's just, Mom, was I adopted? You can tell me the truth. I even said those words to her. You can tell me the truth. It's okay. Tell me. She said, you weren't adopted. You weren't adopted. I had you. I birthed you. Which was what we find out, a half-truth.
Mm.
It was that Sesame Street song, which one of these things is not like the others? Which
Yeah.
one of these things doesn't fit? That was me. And through my early years, into my early 20s, that created a very noticeable, very present friction between her and I. But I couldn't understand why that friction was coming from her. I didn't get it. And then the way she treated my dad, after a while, it really just drove us apart. So we got to the point where we wouldn't speak.
Mm.
Because the one point of comfort I did have, the one element that was my bedrock as a person and as a family life, the one thing I could stand on was my dad, Jack Osborne. He was everything, right? A lot of guys say their dad was a god, and I would probably say the same thing. He held that same position. He loved me more than life, and I know this because he actually used those words many times.
Wow.
He said, son, I would give up my life if it were to save yours. I love you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Which, as a man, I know so many men don't get to hear that from their dad.
Right.
I heard it every time we spoke.
Wow.
So it
I
was
didn't
great.
get that.
I'm sorry, because it's given me a strength of person and a strength of character that's really, really helped me through my life.
Well, I have a complicated relationship with my father, and he's been gone for decades now. But as you know, folks in the NPE community, we find our community, we find our chosen family. So like I sort of glommed on to a couple of friends' dads who took that role on for me, which was incredible. And I love doing this podcast because hearing stories conjures images from the past. And we've never talked about the Pentecostals on the podcast before. But as soon as you mentioned that, it made me think of what I would consider like a chosen family member, like an auntie Sherry, who, when I was a little kid, you know, I was rambunctious and mischievous, and the family that I hung out with all the time, practically lived there. Their best friends were a Pentecostal couple, and they were coming to stay with them, and they kind of like warned me like what kind of behavior I should have in front of them. And so I joked, I said, well, when Miss Sherry's here, I'm going to pinch her on the booty. And I never did that, but it got back to her. And that became like the running thing. Like every time she saw me, she pinched my booty.
Bless her.
Right. The Pentecostal religion is not big on alcohol, but Miss Sherry,
Correct.
She attended a play that I was in. It was an all male drag version of Steel Magnolias and took place in a gay bar. So for her to even just walk through the door and go see a play at a bar, and
was one thing.
My dear friend, Mrs. Killian, her favorite beverage of choice is a Long Island iced tea. And Miss Sherry said, oh, that sounds good. I'll have one of those too. And so 3 Long Islands later, she was the best audience member for that show.
And she had no idea what she was drinking because you can't taste the alcohol.
Exactly. She's like, this is good.
Yeah, and you had to wheel her out of the.
Exactly. So thank you for bringing that memory back.
Well, yeah. And I got this great. Just a little bit about Pentecostals because I grew up in it, but which I won't do for you because I don't want to offend anyone. I do it privately, but yeah, the Pentecostal religion was, it could be a little over the top, I think, for a lot of people. And it certainly played a large part in how we were raised,
mm-hmm.
but it also played a large part in forming my image of who my mother was. This ultra religious, buttoned down, kind of super religious person who played Mary Magdalene every year, Easter play, which I thought was weird, but we'll get to that later.
All right, let's circle back to searching for your Native American heritage.
Yeah, so let's fast forward about 50 years from where we were. And Becky, as I said, is a part-time forensic genealogist. She actually builds family trees and finds family members. She does it for some attorneys throughout the country. If someone's deceased and they need to find all the relatives, she's really good at it. Several years back, she started building my family tree, and she came to me and said, I have literally hundreds of people in your family tree, but there's a problem. And I was like, well, what's the problem? I'm not finding any Native American heritage, like none. There's no Hiawatha anybody anywhere. I said, well, I don't know. Maybe people didn't want to mark down Native American. I can't explain it. She said, well, let's just do this. Why don't you take a DNA test so that genetically we can actually figure out what your makeup is, right? We'll see how much Native American you are. And I was like, oh, sure. I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
Right?
I'm from Cincinnati in northern Kentucky, this area around here. The phrase around here is hold my beer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
What could possibly go wrong? What's good? So, so I spit in the tube, we send it off. I don't even think about it, right? I'm not thinking anything about it. And it comes back, 6 weeks or however long it was, came back, and we're looking at the connections. And I see a bunch of Melton connections, which is what I expected because my mom's maiden name was Melton. So I knew that. But one of the closest connections, really close to the top, was a guy named John Watson, like Dr. John Watson from Sherlock Holmes. Mm-hmm. And he was from Montreal, Canada. And he was living in Prince Edward Island. So for those of you who, don't have Google Maps in front of you, Montreal is 800 miles away from Cincinnati. PEI is 1,500 miles as the crow flies. I'm like, it can't be right. I mean, that just can't be right because I know every one of my cousins. I know my aunts and uncles. Everybody is within 50 miles of Cincinnati. So Becky reaches out to John. John responds. They go back and forth. How are you guys related? And they couldn't get anywhere close. But Ancestry told us it was a first cousin. Matter of fact, such a strong connection, there was a 2% chance he could be a half sibling, which, whatever. It was a really strong connection.
Yeah.
So we figured, well, here's the easy way to figure this out. My Cameron Diaz sister, Laura, which, by the way, she looks like Cameron Diaz, and I do not, or anything like that. Should have been my first clue. I have another sister that looks like Cher. I'm surrounded by these beautiful women, and, Corey, you can see me. I'm no Tom Cruise.
Come on, Steve.
Oh, stop. Hey, Laura, could you take a DNA test? Because I want to triangulate the results. Right. I know our relationship. However you relate to this guy, it'll help us figure this out. So she agrees to take the test, and I forgot all about it. Fast forward another 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Becky and I and a couple of friends are on vacation in Hilton Head. And the week is over. We're heading home. We're on the plane in Savannah, flying back to Cincinnati with a connection through Atlanta. And the boarding door is still open and my phone rings. And it's my sister. It's Laura. And she said, Stevie, which, by the way, she's only like one of 5 people in the world that are allowed to call me Stevie, but that's a different issue. Stevie, I got my DNA test back. And some of this stuff doesn't make any sense. I said, well, the first time you're looking at it, those things can be confusing. I said, just go to your connections page. She did. I said, what do you see? She says, I see all these Meltons. I said, great. That's what you should see. What does it say about John Watson? She says, he's nowhere on my report. Corey, I had already done basically there was 8 permutations left by this point in our research. And I knew what that meant. They were not the words I wanted to hear. And she said, my test is also showing a half brother. J.O. Who's J.O.? And I said, sweetie, J.O., that's me. Jack, Steven Osborne. I'm your half brother. And she said, no, that's not true, because mom is our mom, but dad is our dad. And I said, no, love. What you just told me is that mom is our mom and dad is your dad.
That moment on the plane when Stephen realizes his beloved father isn't biologically his, it just shattered me. It's one of those moments you never forget, and the way he walks us through it, it's vulnerable, brave, and deeply familiar for those of us who experienced a family twist. And trust me, there's more. Stephen's story doesn't stop here. In part 2, I finally get to join the conversation, and we delve into identity, betrayal, and the complicated grace of healing. So take a breath, maybe grab a tissue, and be sure to come back for the rest of this unforgettable journey. And remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.